We're the two teachers. Welcome to the Strangest Things.
Timeless talk about today's topics.
Andy, I tell you, it's one of the strangest things. This last week, we saw Donald Trump at political rallies, but then he's also intensifying the war in Afghanistan. This president wears a lot of hats, a lot of roles. It's strange.
We definitely saw the roles of the president on full display in a very wide range. We saw him in his speech about his new Afghanistan policy, playing the role of commander-in-chief, literally at a military base, speaking to generals, speaking to soldiers as their commander-in-chief, explaining that new policy. But he started that speech with a reflection as chief of state, with his attempt at a unifying message regarding the violence that we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And here we have, Andy, the president traveling the country. It looked like political rallies, like there was an election coming up, and each and every night a different audience, a different message. Is he running for president, or is he governing as president?
Well, that is one of the strangest things about
He is president, right? He's already won the election?
That is one of the strangest things about the Trump presidency, is that he announced that on day one of his presidency that he was running for re-election in 2020. And by announcing that specifically, he can hold and has held political rallies that are campaign rallies, even though technically he's not there supporting any specific candidate in Arizona except himself running for re-election. And that's the president playing the chief of party, the president as the leader of his or her party, the president as a campaigner.
Say, Andy, presidents are chief of party, chief of state. You've mentioned commander-in-chief, chief legislator, working on diplomacy, sanctions against Venezuela. Andy, he's like a haberdashery owner. This president has to wear so many hats. How do you know which hat to wear, and how many hats do you wear in one day?
Well, with a hurricane about to hit the state of Texas, this is the first time the president will also be playing that role as chief executive during a natural disaster. As chief executive, as the leader of Department of Homeland Security, which has FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that's the president as chief executive enforcing the law, making sure that those responsibilities are delegated to the people who are in charge of trying to keep things safe and secure during a natural disaster.
Andy, so many hats for the president, a lot of bad hair days for this president. Say, Andy, remember, friends don't lie. And frankly, I got a bit of a truth ache. You just mentioned the idea of the rule of law. You know, we're a nation of law, but seemingly by way of president executive orders or other means, laws change without the law's words changing.
Well, we see this practically every day, this oddity that our U.S. Constitution, the world's longest lasting written Constitution, but it's only been changed formally, amended formally 27 times. And the only way it's been amended formally is when you have 2/3 of each chamber of Congress proposing an amendment, and those 27 amendments have been ratified by at least 3/4 of the states. But we know that the Constitution has been amended informally, unwritten, thousands and thousands of times.
So, for instance, we know that the Congress is responsible for passing laws, but yet the president can sign an executive order punishing Venezuela, and no member of Congress has even looked at it, let alone not signed it. It's just a sign of the pen.
It would be an informal amendment to the
Informal
Constitution.
Changing American law.
When the Supreme Court makes big decisions that change policy or change laws, that's an informal amendment to the Constitution. No better example than Brown versus the Board of Education, where with that Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court made a part of the Constitution informally become the prohibition of racial segregation in public schools.
So, Andy, how does checks and balances work in a legal system in which it doesn't quite look like the constitutional makeup of how laws are made?
I mean, how does it work is the checks and balances can change over time. They can evolve over time. We know that presidents, particularly in times of war, have much more power than they had during times of peace. When you look back over 220 years, the executive branch is so much more powerful. And again, not necessarily because of written amendments, formal amendments to the Constitution, but more traditions, laws that happen over time, those informal amendments.
Andy, it's time to walk through our curiosity door. And this is actually a question coming out of my first hour class. A student pulled me aside after class and said, Mr. Larson, what's this idea about Trump shutting the government down? I thought we just did the White House renovations. What's this all about the debt ceiling? Is the ceiling something to do with the Oval Office? Andy, on September 29th, the government of the United States runs out of money unless the Congress votes to increase this debt ceiling.
Well, debt ceiling and the idea of borrowing money, that you can connect that back to Congress's formal powers. This is one of their express powers, to be the national government through Congress is able to borrow money. They can print money. So the legislative branch is in charge of that money. And yes, we have a lot of debt, almost $20 trillion in debt.
$20 trillion.
That's the total amount of money our national government owes. If they don't pay that debt, we're told that very bad things can happen to the economy in terms of the value of money and the savings that people have acquired. And so Congress has always paid that debt on time. Congress has always borrowed the money needed to pay off that debt and the interest on the debt. But President Trump did seem to make suggestions that he's willing to make that debt negotiations part of some domestic policy.
So if Congress doesn't raise the debt, then government bills don't get paid, correct? I mean, Social Security checks won't be mailed out. Doctors won't be paid.
That's more the budget, Dan. That's more the fiscal policy of the budget and spending that money. When we're talking about the debt, we're talking about those people and institutions that have loaned the government money, expecting interest will be paid, seeing the U.S. currency and U.S. debt as a very safe investment. But if the U.S. debt is not seen as a safe investment, there have been some pretty dire predictions as to how that could affect the overall economic financial health.
So kind of curious how we're going to make a lot of political hay out of this debt ceiling debate, but you're telling us it's going to rise, no questions asked.
I didn't say that.
McConnell, I heard the Senate Majority Leader say there is zero chance that the debt ceiling will not be raised.
Again, it would be a very, very significant decision if Congress wasn't able to raise the debt ceiling. But this week we heard that the president is willing to place a higher risk at putting some of his domestic priorities, namely building the border wall, as part of those negotiations. That's an unusual combination. That's a pretty strangest thing that we haven't seen before.
Say, this has been the Strangest Things. We're the two teachers.
No fancy words.
No fancy suits. Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.